Welcome to Better Sex, where you get the information and inspiration to create and enjoy your best possible sex life. Join your host, sex therapist Jessa Zimmerman, as she brings you expert guests, helpful tips, knowledge, and strategies to improve your intimate relationships. And now, your host, Jessa Zimmerman.
Hey everybody, it's Jessa. Welcome back to the Better Sex Podcast. So glad you're here tuning in. And let's see, as I'm recording episodes today, which is always quite a ways before they're released, but I just recently released my new webinar for free called How to Want Sex More, or Help Your Partner Too, without feeling pressure and obligation. So if you are interested in joining me for that free masterclass, you're going to learn the 5 most common things people are doing wrong that are blocking desire. And whether you're the person struggling to feel desire or that's your partner, there's a lot of really actionable ideas in there that can start to make a difference. So you can find that at intimacywithease.com/masterclass. And it's a nice segue into our topic today, which is about getting closer to God through pleasure. I'm talking to Rachel Alba, who is a sex coach for people raised in Christian traditions that are struggling with shame or really negativity around sex and are at a point in their lives where they're willing to kind of take that on and try to transform that, I guess, frankly. So she's got, she shares her personal story of her journey around this and a lot about the idea of faith development and opening up to new ideas about sex, and then how to explore that and reduce the kind of shame response that people can have. So I hope you get a ton out of the episode. And before we start the show today, it is sponsored by Intimacy with Ease. It's a method to help otherwise happy couples achieve a sex life that is easy and fun for both of them, so you can actually just enjoy your sex life with zero stress. For more information, if you want to watch a brief little training video that's available, all of that, go to intimacywithease.com. So Rachel, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, I saw your post on social media and I thought, oh my gosh, I have to interview her. So I'm really glad that we could make this work. So would you start by just sort of talking a little bit about who you are and how you've come into this work, like what your, real focus is?
Yeah, so I work as a sex coach specifically for people who are coming from Christian backgrounds. And I got into that specifically because, not surprisingly, I was raised Christian myself. I was raised Roman Catholic, and I was fortunately not raised with as many of the troublesome teachings as other people were potentially raised with. But sort of on the other end of the spectrum, I was at a parish that was new. And so we were always pulling priests from Catholic University of America's John Paul II Institute for Marriage and Family Studies. So I lived outside of DC. That's where Catholic University is. And the JP2 Institute for Marriage and Family Studies basically focuses on John Paul II's theology of the body, which is very much focused on sexuality. That document has a lot of issues with it, in part because it's very gender essentialist, like women have to do women things, men have to do men things. Intersex conditions don't exist. Transgender people are like totally written out of the narrative. Homosexuality is wrong, the whole laundry list of things.
Yeah.
But it's a document that really talks about how sex is a space for us to really come back to the Garden of Eden and very much experience union with each other, union with the divine, even a fuller union with ourselves at the same time. And that's a really positive viewpoint that I have realized in working with evangelical individuals or people raised from the evangelical communities, that's not always what's even said in those places.
Right.
So at least even if I was getting all these prohibitions along with it, I also had this sense that sex is really good and pleasure is really good. And we can experience God's grace through those things. And so with that, when I went to college, I started to talk to more people about no, but sex is a positive thing. And this is why. And then when I left college after that, I was still sort of realizing that lots of people weren't taught that, and specifically realized that when I was living in New York City and I would go to Tantra workshops or Taoist sexual practice workshops or Kabbalah workshops or whatnot, And so many of the people that were there were from Christian backgrounds. So there was this sense that not only did they want to have better sex generally, but people coming from Christian backgrounds, even if they didn't identify as Christian anymore, wanted to have a spiritual experience of sex. And so to me, it really said, wait, but the Christian tradition already has this in it. We're just doing a really bad job of communicating that. And so how can we start to actually bring the positive approach to sexuality into our conversations within a Christian context?
Yeah, and I would imagine that the messages, the divisions within the Christian church, right? There's a lot of variety here, right? Of backgrounds and of teachings and of attitudes about this. And if you're talking about, would you say, the JP2 document, which I imagine is saying it's a way to go back to the Garden of Eden within marriage.
Oh, yeah, 100%. And within heterosexual marriage, to be very clear.
Right.
Of course, as an individual, believe that it doesn't have to be married and it doesn't have to be heterosexual. But
right. But that's on the positive end of the spectrum, I suppose. What are people learning on the other end or in between? Well,
then, I think even within Catholicism, there's a tendency toward, sex is only for procreation.
Yeah.
Or if we're going from like a very Augustinian approach, talking about St. Augustine, then you've got not only is sex only for procreation, but ultimately he's going to say things like, we only have sex because it's like we don't have control over our bodies, which we get a little bit of that in Paul's writings as well in the New Testament. I don't think that's really what Paul was intending. I think it's somewhat of a misinterpretation. I also don't think that Augustine is really intending to be that harsh either in what he's saying, but it gets interpreted that way, and therefore it sort of pushes all the way down. And as that becomes sort of massaged over the course of history, you get Puritanism, right? In the 14, 15, 1600s. I don't know. I'm not really great with the history of Christianity in that regard. And then of course you've got evangelicalism, which really pushes it from a place of not necessarily even being grounded in the tradition in that sense of going back to the early writers in Christianity, but really coming from somebody's interpretation of a particular translation of the Bible. And that's what you go off of. And that can be very much obviously sex only in marriage between a man and a woman, and masturbation is wrong. And, pleasure generally is suspect because pleasure can lead us to sin. So don't even, the Joshua Harris book, I Kissed Dating Goodbye, which of course now he's completely renounced it. And he's very much apologetic about the fact that he wrote that book and it's no longer published because he feels so bad about it. But that was even saying you shouldn't even hold hands or kiss before you get married, because that could lead you to care more about the physical component of the relationship rather than the emotional component, all those sorts of things. So that's just body is suspect.
Yeah. It's dangerous, right? And if you get a little taste of this thing, you're going to lose control. That's part of the messaging around this, right? We shouldn't be having pleasure at all, or. Yeah. What a burden, that's what I'm sitting here thinking. Wow, what a burden I know this as a sex therapist, right? Talking to clients, what burdens people come in with around this. And even for somebody, if somebody's gotten a more positive take on, wow, once you're married, sex is this wonderful, joyful experience that God has built into our humanness, right? There's this challenge about, but I'm supposed to switch on a dime on my honeymoon? It's been scary and sinful and stay away from it forever. And all of a sudden I'm supposed to embrace it.
Totally. And I think I'm sure this is similar to the clients that you have too, but a lot of my clients are in that position of saying, well, we waited until marriage. This is the only person I've ever had sex with. I don't even know how, especially with women, I don't even know how to get in touch with my turn on.
Yeah.
I think really what happens for a lot of women, especially in purity culture spaces, women are the gatekeepers of all sexual activity. And so women learn, and I think we're more adept at being able to do this anyway, just because of our hormones and the style of arousal we have, since more women are, we've got more responsive desire sort of generally than spontaneous desire, which is spontaneous desire is you sort of desire sex and then you go get it. And responsive desire is where you get into the act of doing something that is sexual and then you start to feel aroused.
Right.
Seems to be more so what women experience. But if you've never really had any experiences before, then you don't know what turn on feels like. When you do feel turned on, or when you do feel sexual pleasure, like someone starts to touch your clitoris, or go down on you, it feels scary. And so it just like gets shut down immediately because our brains are the biggest sex organ we have.
Right.
So if your brain's not going to go along with it, if you don't feel safe in that moment, there's no way you're going to feel turned on. And what ends up happening is a lot of these women on forums on Facebook and things like that will talk about, am I asexual? Am I demisexual? And that may very well be the case. But what I've noticed is that a lot of them are really just so out of touch with their bodies that they don't know the potential of turn on or how to have turn on feel safe.
Yeah, and justifiably out of touch, right? I mean, it's not something to be ashamed of or embarrassed about or like, oh my gosh, it's my fault. It's like, well, how would you know if you've never spent any time with your body or with anybody else with your body? Like, how would people know?
And then on top of it, like if you're coming from, at least in Catholicism, and I know in other traditions too, masturbation is considered sinful. And the best way we get to know what we like and what we don't like is by actually just touching ourselves. And
Right.
so even if you've moved through the idea that masturbation is wrong, there's still this embodied sense of this is dirty or this is wrong, or it's like, this is icky.
Yeah.
Like, this is gross. The fact that I have secretions down there and there's folds, like it's just gross and it smells funny or whatever. And it's like, there's a lot of having to move through that in order to be able to even do the things that will allow you to experience turn on and pleasure and arousal and all those things.
Right. Right. Is there anything else you can think of that's sort of how this shows up for people? Is it, once they're an adult, maybe they're married, they're starting to be sexual or to want to explore that part of themselves. What else has been packed in their baggage?
I think I'm going to speak a little bit to men for a moment, because women, it's usually like lack of turn on or painful penetration, like a lot of vaginismus, that kind of thing. But for men, I've seen a couple of things that seem to be pretty common. And one is, especially in evangelical communities, a lot of times men are taught that they can't really have real friendships with women. And therefore, when they start to do the deconstruction process, which is the process of deconstructing your evangelical beliefs and either stepping out of evangelicalism or starting to find your own path. And you can push this in any Christian context. It just seems to really have a culture of it within evangelical communities or the ex-evangelical communities. And a lot of times for those men, it can be very challenging to figure out, like, how do I actually relate to females that aren't my potential sexual partner? And so figuring out for them, really, really exploring, how do you experience your erotic energy and how do you allow yourself to feel attracted to somebody, but not necessarily like energetically give that off.
Yeah, not to sexualize it, really.
Super subtle, but real important so that you don't come off as skeevy or like I'm sure we've all been around somebody where it's just like, you can tell that like that sexual energy is just like seeping off of them in weird ways. And there are men that realize that want to sort of rein it in and figure out, how do I actually handle my erotic energy?
It's interesting. I've never really thought about that being, I mean, it makes so much sense, but that being sort of a legacy of a Christian upbringing, and that maybe other people that didn't have that experience have mastered that through middle school or high school or something, right? And I didn't really put that together, that if you're not just relating to women, that would be difficult to do.
Yeah. The other thing that comes up a lot is if people have gotten divorced or if people have never married, but they're moving out of the religious tradition that they were raised in, trying to figure out, how do I date and how do I navigate my new sexual ethic now that the sexual ethic I was raised in is not one I'm going to hold on to anymore, and figuring out, when do I have sex? How far is too far for me in this particular circumstance? And having a space to talk about that's non-judgmental, that still has an ear toward the spiritual components of sexuality without being puritanical about it.
Yeah. All right. So people are going to come into this work with either lack of knowledge, lack of experience, potentially shame, potentially fear, potentially pain, or anxiety, potentially not knowing how to relate with, a potential partner. I mean, there's a lot, but that can be going on, right?
Yep.
How do you help them move through all that? Like, do you have sort of a process that people go through? Like, I'm imagining some of this has to be experiential for them,
There's like a few, I have like 4 pillars that I work with. One of them is I focus a lot on developmental spirituality, which I can get into a little bit more because that's really important.
Yeah. Yeah.
One is simply anatomy and physiology and like just knowing the body.
So basically sexuality education.
Right.
Okay.
And then I actually put the physical piece separate from sexology because our embodiment is different from the study of sexuality. But learning how to be in your body is actually a really essential piece to being a fully alive sexual person. Right. And then the last piece I always put in there is mindful sensuality. So really, how are you mindful in your experience of your senses, not only within the bedroom, but also outside of it, because that's going to give you more pleasure in the bedroom if you're more aware of pleasure outside of it. The two pieces that I think are really important that I sort of always sort of start with, one is the spiritual development piece. A lot of times the churches that people are coming from that are really heavy on accidentally offering people sexual shame, I'll put it that way, because I don't think it's an intentional thing most of the time.
I was going to say never. I think, yeah, okay.
They're just not actually doing the thing that's going to be best for the people in their communities necessarily, or not best for all of the people in their communities. Because I have seen people that actually really thrive under those conditions, and that's great, but that's not most people.
Right.
But one of the best things to tell somebody is that faith actually has stages. And by the time that you're moving from specifically the state, they're numbered. They were laid out by this man named James Fowler, who did a whole bunch of studies on stages of faith, interviewed a bunch of people, and it kept showing up no matter what religious tradition somebody was coming from. It even applies to people who are atheist, but there's about 5 or 6 stages of faith that people move through or can move through over the course of their life. And the stage transition from 3 to 4 tends to be where people start to be conscious of the shame that they experience and want to not have it. Mm. And so I'll explain a little bit about what that transition is, because I think it's not only fascinating, but very important. Okay. Stage 3 is where we are placing our faith in an external authority. So what that means is that if you're Catholic, like I was Catholic, the main authority that I placed my faith in was the Vatican, maybe some priests, that sort of thing, where whatever they say is what I'm going to believe and what I'm going to try to live my life toward. Right. External authority. Yes. Yeah. And then the next stage 4, is where you start to place that external authority within yourself. So now it's self-authored. You have self-authority. And that transition can be really hard because you have to break ties with that external authority. And a lot of times what causes that to happen is a sexual experience that you were told should feel bad, that should separate you from God, that should be whatever. And what ends up actually happening is you don't feel separated from God. You feel good about it. You feel like you built your relationship, or you just feel like there's nothing there. You didn't feel that like fire brimstone thing. So something about the messaging or the training I've been getting cannot be right because now I've got an experience that shows me differently. Yep. And then you've got to figure out, how do I reconcile this? Yeah. And what's super tricky is that even if somebody's reconciled it in their minds, their bodies take longer to get there. Yes, absolutely. And that's where physical practices are super important. And specifically, I'll get into the shame response in a second. I want to say one more thing about stages of faith. What's important is that a lot of these people are going to feel like they're backsliding. So the second that they start to feel like it's okay to have sex outside of marriage, or it's okay to masturbate, or there's a part of them that wants to feel like it's okay, they've been taught that feeling is actually them backsliding, is them moving away from God. Right. But once you start to look at these stages of faith and you situate their experience within this transition, they start to say, oh, I'm actually getting closer to God or the divine or the universe or whatever. I'm actually progressing in my stages of faith. And that gives people permission to really go into it. So that's sort of a big piece of it, is like giving people permission to follow what they want, as opposed to, and follow their intuition, rather than feeling constricted and compelled to stay in the box that they were raised in. So that context that this is actually progress towards something that's an evolution or development, as opposed to, oh, wait, this is the devil at play or something telling you Exactly. And for somebody who's in that transitional moment where they still actually need some level of authority figure telling them something like this, where it's like, this is by some guy that like worked at Harvard and Boston College and like started his own thing at Emory at some point in time. Like, this is real. It's been studied. It looks very authoritative. So, that's right. So that's still somewhat of an external authority, but it's different from the Right.
the Vatican or the priest or something. Yeah.
But it's giving you permission to move into your own authority. So, which is kind of a funny, tricky thing. But as a therapist, I'm sure you're like, oh yeah, of course, that would make sense. That like you need this little like bridge to get to the next stage.
Hey, we're going to just take a short little break here, and I want to let you know about Intimacy with Ease, the method that helps otherwise happy couples create a sex life that is fun, easy, light for both people. So if you are an otherwise happy couple, if sex is the elephant in the room or sex is the little bit of the challenge for you guys, you may want to check this out. You can go to intimacywithease.com and you'll see information there. You'll see short videos. You'll have access to a full webinar about it. All kinds of information to let you know if this would be the right thing for you.
But wait, I have a question though, because I'm a man. Okay, so I can totally get that if people have an experience of positivity around sex and it's different than the way they were raised, that might start this change, this transition. But I see an awful lot of people in my practice who have yet to have that kind of experience. And I think they hope for it, or like maybe they're aware it's possible, or I mean, it seems like they must enter a little bit of that transition on faith in a way, like, right, they haven't actually had that, but they realize there's still a problem.
I think that's where like they might see it in another person, or they might be exposed to it via anything out there in the world,
yeah,
a movie, a TV show, or it could simply be that they're looking at secular society and saying, you know, I want to be able to support my friends that are gay and getting married, and I want to feel super confident going to their weddings and not feeling guilty about it. That might be the transition point.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's something in their own lived reality typically that starts that process of at least even questioning, are these teachings right? And then there's usually some sort of source of pain where they try to live into what they hope for and realize that it doesn't feel the way they want it to feel.
Yeah.
And they need to move into something else.
Yeah. So you're not I mean, I don't know if you're an expert on the faith development stages and all that, but the one thing that's coming to mind as you're talking about this is there's somehow one is better to move away from listening to what the teachings of your church is, like that this is a positive progression. And I'm curious where the end point is, because people might be thinking, wait, do I have to abandon my faith or my tradition? Or how do I, if I'm not supposed to listen to the priests anymore or believe what they've been teaching me my whole life, like where does that leave me in terms of faith?
So I think what's really important is to realize that it's a growth hierarchy rather than a dominance hierarchy. So it's not really that one is better than the other.
Okay.
The question of, is this stage adequate for your thriving? And what that means is that somebody could be at stage 3 for their whole life, and there's lots of people who are, and it's super perfect for them. They don't need to go anywhere. Nothing wrong with it. They can hang out there forever. Other people will not be content there, and they'll either be discontented for a long time, or they'll grow into the next stage and feel a little bit better.
Yeah.
And there's a variety of ways to move from one stage of faith to the other. So especially for 3 to 4, and I've seen this go in a lot of directions. There's a lot of people that go into atheism. There's a lot of people that go into like yoga classes and crystals and essential oils and things. Goddess, oral
Tantra, all these places, right? Where they're still looking for a spiritual practice. Yeah.
I'm like, that's me. I totally have done that too. So I'm not judging people when I say that. But then there's also the people that do in fact stay in their faith tradition. And they're able to, for at least a little while, and I saw this a lot in my graduate program, which is in theology and ministry. And my graduate studies were mostly focused on these stages of faith and how to apply them to sexual development. But a lot of people are able to be in the church that they were raised in and dissent. And so it's, for some people, they would call it like cafeteria Catholics is the term that you get in Catholicism. But you're sort of picking and choosing the things that work for you. I think a lot of people that are more interested in like liberation theology are going to fit into that context. Mm-hmm. The people that focus on the teachings of Jesus as like loving and accepting and all of his miracles are really just inviting people more into community rather than having them be ostracized. Those kinds of things are more stage 4. I think what happens in stage 5, or rather what does happen in stage 5, but the way that I would frame it would be that you stop seeing your faith tradition as the only one that has truth. So whether that be I'm atheist and therefore I believe that atheism is the only place to find truth, or I get really into Goddess Oracle decks and I think that's the only place to find truth, or I'm stay Christian and I believe that that's the only place that has the fullest version of truth. You start to leave that behind when you transition to stage 5 and start to be able to see that any tradition has the fullness of truth. It's more of a matter of, is this the right set of practices and stories for me and my soul to flourish the most? And that's a really hard thing for people to grasp if that's not something that they're already I mean, all of these things, it's like, if you're not at that point,
Yeah, it must sound
sense.
just like, what? This is alarming.
Yeah, it's not going to make sense, and it's totally cool
Right.
if it doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean you're not great at life or that you're not spiritual enough. It just means whatever. It's like if you tried to explain multivariable calculus to me right now, I wouldn't understand it. But I don't need to know multivariable calculus. I need to know maybe a little bit of algebra at most when I'm budgeting. And that's the extent to the knowledge I need. That's adequate.
Yeah.
It would be cool if I learned multivariable calculus, but it's not what I need because I'm not like an astrophysicist or whatever. I don't even know who uses that math.
Right. But I guess the maybe the takeaway for anybody who's concerned listening is you're not going to have to abandon your faith or abandon your tradition or be excommunicated or well, maybe in certain places, but you'd be able to find a way to stay in relationship to God and spirituality and still decide to think about some of these things differently.
Totally. 100%. Yeah. And there's a lot of people out there that are doing work around this, like the Incarnation Institute she sometimes calls herself Rev Bev and sometimes and she goes by Dale more so now.
Yeah.
She's a great resource. She puts out amazing, every once in a while she does like free 4-week classes as part of her church. She's at like a combination UCC and Church of Christ, I think.
Yeah. I interviewed her probably at least 2 years ago now. So there is, I don't know the number, but there is an episode for listeners if you want with her. She's great.
She is great. And there's a bunch of people out there that talk about, and I often will on Facebook and things talk about the theology of making sex positive Christianity.
Yeah.
Because it is possible. You just have to dig a little deeper to quote that song from The Princess and the Frog. I love Disney.
So let's talk a little bit about, I mean, we can't cover your entire method or whatever, but a little bit about what would people do? What are some of the exercises or the ways that you can transform this in your body? Because like you said, in your head, you might get it or be open to this, but then your body's having a different response.
So the first thing I like to remind people is that shame is actually a positive thing, which I know sounds crazy, but our initial shame response is actually meant to protect us.
Mm-hmm.
So it's positive in the sense where it was meant to protect us. And a lot of times what happens is we just didn't ever actually like grow out of that shame response that we had around sexuality. So the way that I think about it and the story that I usually tell is if you imagine a small child crawling across the floor and they're about to stick their finger in the socket and you as the loving, caring adult in the room says, no. And you probably say it pretty loudly and strongly to get their attention. And the kid stops, but because it was loud and because it was kind of scary, their sympathetic nervous system gets all triggered. So now they've got adrenaline rushing through their body, and sympathetic nervous system is your fight or flight response. And so they've got all these hormones now, and they just start sobbing because it's just too much for them to feel. And so you, still being the loving, caring adult in the room, scoop them up and you hug them close and you pat them on the back and you give them some kisses on their forehead and you tell them how beautiful and wonderful they are. And now you're engaging their parasympathetic nervous system, their rest and digest, their, healing, all that sort of relaxation, ooey gooey goodness. So we have to do the same thing for ourselves when shame kicks in. And so what I usually tell people is you want to make sure that you're doing a few different things. First off, whatever you do before you do the thing that you feel shame about, which is usually I tell people to start with masturbation because it's by yourself. You don't have to deal with another person. It's simpler.
Yeah.
Do something beforehand that calms you down. That could be a bath. That could be dancing to some of your favorite music. It could be sipping a cup of tea, like whatever it is that makes you feel safe. And a lot of times that can also mean like wearing your favorite fuzzy robe or wrapping yourself in a nice warm blanket, like whatever it is that's going to help you feel safe because you really want to feel safe. And then just do a gentle body exploration of pleasurable touch. And you can start in places that feel safe. Things like the inside of your forearm, just gently brushing there. You can massage your scalp, playing with your hair. You can start with your legs or your feet or whatever feels good and still feels safe. And then once you feel nice and relaxed still, and you feel really safe about it, and then you start to do something that feels a little bit more charged.
Right.
And so this could be still gentle. And I'm going to use female anatomy because I have female anatomy and I know it better, but also because I have far fewer clients that are men and have problems masturbating.
Yeah.
I will simply be honest with that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So to start with lots of oil on your hands and just massaging the exterior, and not even for the sake of getting sexual pleasure out of it. You don't even have to focus on your clit. You just got to have it feel good. It can feel like a lovely, relaxing massage that you would get at a spa. Doesn't have to feel like you're magically getting aroused.
Yeah. Yeah.
And just start with that. Usually what I tell people too is like, even before you start touching your genitals, to tap into just like sensing that part of your body and ask permission. And it can sound really simple, but especially when it can be scary and can bring up those feelings of shame or guilt or whatnot, getting consent from your own body to be touched can actually be like yet another mechanism of increasing that safety feeling.
Yeah.
And then you only go as far as feels safe. Once it starts to feel a little bit more scary, you back off. If you feel like you have it in you, maybe you go back to it and try a little bit more, but you sort of just be really gentle with yourself, because the thing that you don't want to do is turn on your fight or flight response.
Right.
You've got to stay in this like nice, calm, parasympathetic state. And that's sort of how you do it, is by really being gentle with yourself, knowing that you'll get there.
And I imagine if you end up in fight or flight, if somehow all of a sudden you're overwhelmed by shame or something, that's where you could hold yourself, give yourself hugs and kisses like the mom in the story, right? Like be gentle with yourself, calm yourself down. It's okay. We got
this. And the same thing, like on the back end, when you finish your session with yourself, like do something else that's calming. You know, watch your favorite episode of Seinfeld or have another cup of tea, whatever it is that's going to make you feel good and relaxed and that feels safe again.
Yeah.
And really doing those bookending of safety so that the middle part can be a little bit more, feeling a little bit more edgy without overstimulating your system.
Right. So if you had, I mean, in a way, I think I know what you're going to say, but I'm still going to ask you to say it. If you had a takeaway that you want people that are struggling with this religious upbringing and the shame or the burden it might have given them, what do you most want them to hear, believe, internalize? Like, what's the...
God created your body for pleasure. God didn't give us nerve endings simply because we need them to be able to like feel textures on trees.
Yeah.
God gave us pleasure and the ability to experience pleasure because God wants us to experience pleasure. And I think, I'm so sorry for the little creature in the background.
That's okay. Hopefully people are enjoying the dog as part of this interview.
The other piece that I'd want people to know is that when we think about the clitoris, it really has no purpose other than sexual pleasure.
And that's not an accident, right? God didn't just, stuck an extra part on.
Right. And it's also not an accident. Like, I think there's a lot of misconceptions that, like, thanks to the like homunculus or whatever it was way back when that was said to be true, that like we didn't start male and become female. Everybody starts female and some people become male.
Right.
And so the clitoris is there very intentionally.
Yeah.
It's been there since the beginning of your little zygote life.
So where can people learn more about you? If you want to mention a website or any sort of, freebie or offering you've got, your podcast, things like that, so people know where to find you.
Yeah. So I've got lots of different places. My Instagram account is at rachel.alba.coaching. My website is www.sexwithspirit.com. You want to type that whole thing into your browser. You don't want to Google sex with spirit. What will come up is people who want to have sex with ghosts.
Okay.
Didn't do the SEO thing before I got the domain name. And then I always have on my website, when you sign up for my mailing list, there's a free 3 keys to releasing sexual shame mini class that you can get access to when you sign up. And then the podcast that I host with the lovely Lori Kimmerly is Sex Positive Christian Feminists. And you can find that all the places you can find podcasts.
I'll stick all these links in the show notes too, so people don't have to be furiously writing all that down.
I know there's and they're all different names.
Right. Well, thank you so much for being on the show. I can't wait to get this out in the world.
You've been listening to Better Sex. Please visit our website, bettersexpodcast.com, for show notes and additional episodes.
And that's a wrap for today. I really hope you enjoyed the episode. If you are enjoying the podcast, if some of this material resonates with you and you would like to make a difference and make sure that this keeps coming out in the world once a week, ongoing, there are a couple things you could do to show your appreciation. The first would be to go to iTunes and rate and review the show. That really helps us be found by new listeners when you review the show on iTunes. You can find a link at bettersexpodcast.com/iTunes. The other thing I want to invite you to consider is becoming a Patreon. For a small monthly pledge, you get some benefits. So for $2 a month, you get advance access to every single episode. For $5 a month, you get a chapter of my upcoming new book. And for $10 a month, I host quarterly get-to-know-you and question-and-answer chats over the web, and you get invited to that. I would love to have your membership in that, become part of the Better Sex family. You can find a link at bettersexpodcast.com/Patreon, which is Patreon. Again, thanks for listening. I'm glad you're here. Feel free to comment, ask questions, get in touch. I'd love to hear from listeners. Thanks.